turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching into freedom land. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching into freedom land.
Good morning. We're going to light the chalice first thing this morning with these words from Zen master, teacher, and poet Thich Nhat Hanh, who died on January 22nd at his home in Vietnam. He was 95 years old. He authored several books. The most well-known is The Miracle of Mindfulness. About the practice of mindfulness, he says, it is like growing lotus flowers. You cannot grow lotus flowers on marble. You have to grow them on the mud. Without mud, you cannot have a lotus flower. Without suffering, you have no way to learn how to be compassionate. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Whidbey Island. My name is Ruth Richards. I'll be serving as your worship associate today. We've been meeting virtually for nearly 2 years now and continue to welcome each one of you as warmly as this sterile Zoom platform allows. Your presence gracing this service gives meaning to our efforts as we work to sustain our community despite not being able to gather in person. Thank you so much for choosing to spend your time here this morning. One logistical reminder, there will be 2 breakout rooms after the service. One will be for a discussion of the service with our guest speakers, Libba Pinto and Clark Hangen. The other will be a socializing room, and we'll say more about these after the postlude. Please join me in speaking our affirmation. Love is the spirit of this congregation, and service is its practice. This is our great covenant to dwell together in peace, to seek truth in love, and to help one another. Deepak Chopra writes, everything that happens in the universe begins with intention. When I decide to buy a birthday present, wiggle my toes, or call a friend, it all starts with intention. The sages of India observed thousands of years ago that our destiny is ultimately shaped by our deepest intentions and desires. We've spent a month with this idea of intention, and I'd like to recap a few of the highlights, the takeaways that got my attention, in particular those that focused on actions. For in this present world, it is so easy and so understandable to lose heart, to believe nothing can be done to affect change for the better, to despair, and to give up. But now here's your opportunity to sit with that suffering for a bit, then let little by little inch your way back to trusting that the universe will hear your intention and help you to realize it. Along the way are lots of people who, along with also working their way back, are willing to help. And we've seen a few of them this month. On January 2nd, Joseph Bednarik mentioned the research behind the physical act of writing down your goals, hopes, resolutions, how setting that intention to act is a key to success. He mentioned his poet friend, Dan Gerber, who decided to read all the works of Rainer Maria Rilke in chronological order and has been doing so over and over again for 40 years. Mr. Gerber learned to acknowledge and embrace change, recognizing that resisting it fosters fear. For the next 2 Sundays, The Reverend Emily Melcher and Pastor Tom Bozeman offered some gentle suggestions about approaching resolutions and a bit of tough love about a congregation's tendency to stay in a comfortable place rather than evolving from an I church to a we church. Individually, they said, do resolutions get to the heart of what we want? Perhaps it would be wise to ask if that resolution would make me or you more whole. Within congregations, UUs would benefit from recognizing that we tend to cling to individualism and exceptionalism, and we have an allergic reaction to authority. Instead, we can look at our congregation with brutal honesty, check to see that our actions align with our values, and begin again in love. And last Sunday, Anna Singdeo spelled out the connection between intention and attention. The first being a compass bearing, and the second being a way finding practice. How do you get to that compass bearing destination? She asked us, what life experiences have nudged you to examine your intention? Here are a few of my favorite Merriam-Webster synonyms for the word action: practice, drive, vitality, grit, determination, presence, and accomplishment. And there are a couple of potentially risky ones to be aware of as well: assertive, aggressive. The first recurring theme among all this month's services is change. Change is the one constant in our lives, so we can only benefit from learning how to embrace it. The second recurring theme for me starts with one of the action words, practice. Joseph recommended that we practice seeing with your eyes, practice seeing with your heads, practice seeing with your hearts. Continuing with Deepak Chopra's comment that our destiny is ultimately shaped by our deepest intentions and desires, he fills out this idea with these words from ancient Vedic text. You are what your deepest desire is. As your desire is, so is your intention. As your intention is, so is your will. As your will is, so is deed. As your deed is, so is your destiny. A friend of ours back on the East Coast, Jean Cotton, has written the following song as a fervent wish that we learn to work together to bring to fruition a more just world.
Look what we have here. What can we do about it? I remember long ago what my brother Larry said. It could all happen here. Now it's happening here. What are we gonna do about it? We're standing here aghast. It's happening fast. What can we do? We could try to pull together. We could try to work it out. There's no reason we should lose what took all time to bring about. We are all in this together. That's the only way it works. We could see this as the last chance to stop acting like jerks. We could all work it out. We could all work it out. They made people slaves here. Treatment was unspeakable. It follows us today like it never left us. How people act, what people say, it's like an attitude. You're not worth as much as I am. Is it possible to break? What will it take? What can we do? And there's a problem of money and what greed can do. And what do we do about the climate change? And good Lord, what can we do? We could try to pull together. We could try to work it out. There's no reason we should lose what took all time to bring about. We are all in this together. That's the only way it works. We could see this as a last chance to stop acting like jerks. could work it out. We could all work it out.
The deep longing that I hear in Jean's plea to work it out just vibrates my heartstrings. To be witness to the cruelty, disregard, ignorance, and disdain in today's world is a challenging test of our compassion. And yet one can find beauty and strength and kindness, of course, in our world as well. We seek and find these in our own community with our sharing of joys and sorrows. Our congregation thrives not only because of your generosity in action, also your creativity and financial support. Please donate any amount. It's the practice and intention that is your true gift to this community. Thanks so much for your generosity. Our first guest speaker this morning is Gansho Clark Hanjin. Clark is a Zen Buddhist priest training under the guidance of Sensei Joshin Burns and the Breadloaf Mountain Zen community. He is also a graduate of the Buddhist chaplaincy training program at Upaya Zen Center. Clark leads a small practice group in Massachusetts and serves as a chaplain in his local community. He's been a student of Buddhist practice for nearly 40 years and offers support for spiritual and ethical practice in everyday life. This morning, he reflects on the central role that intention plays in Buddhist practice, including a few concrete ways we might work with our intentions. He also shares his own story of how he is engaged with his intention not to support militarism. Welcome, Clark. And before you start, if you want to say just a couple words about the blizzard, we'd love to know. Clark is in Massachusetts.
Yep, we woke up to about a foot of snow this morning, so haven't had that much in a few years. So it's beautiful out. We're enjoying it. Well, thank you, Ruth. So glad to be with all of you today. And I just want to make sure, is the sound still okay? Ruth, yeah?
Yep.
Working? Right.
Yep.
All right, great. Well, good to be with you all. So in Zen temples, there's a traditional verse that hangs near the meditation hall. It's, life and death are of supreme importance. Time passes swiftly and opportunity is lost. Let us awaken, take heed. Do not squander your life. So if this is the case, where shall we direct our energies? The Buddha said that his primary concern was the end of suffering. And he suggested that the path to the end of suffering is paved with our skillful activity in 8 areas of life. And you might be familiar with the symbol for the Buddhist tradition. It's a wagon wheel with 8 spokes. And they signify the Eightfold Path, these 8 areas of life where we try to practice skillfully. It's our speech, our action, our livelihood, our effort, our awareness, our concentration, our view, and our intention. So we want to consider this particular spoke today. What's it mean to practice skillful intention? And the Buddha said skillful intention is intention to renounce the causes of suffering, intention to be of goodwill, the intention to refrain from harm. Now that's a bigger and bolder scope of intention than most of us usually take on. But the Buddha suggests that when we keep training our heart mind in this direction, this type of bold intention bears fruit. Buddha also said, mind is the forerunner of all actions. All deeds are led by mind, created by mind. If one speaks or acts with a corrupt mind, suffering follows, just as the wheel follows the hoof of an ox pulling a cart. Mind is the forerunner of all actions. All deeds are led by mind, created by mind. If one speaks or acts with a serene mind, happiness follows, as surely as one's shadow. So what does this mean for our daily everyday lives. How do we work with our intentions so they flourish into actions that create some ease and freedom? So this morning I'd like to offer 3 approaches that might be helpful. First, support your intention with a vow. And the notion of vow is important because it marks a transition. When we take a vow, we don't just have a thought to do something. We commit to devoting attention and effort to it. And a vow also traditionally has a public aspect. We don't make this commitment behind some interior veil. We make the commitment visible to others. So a vow is like a threshold we cross when we're serious about working with our intention. In Zen Buddhism, we practice with a variety of vows, beginning on the day that we formally enter the path. And we renew these vows publicly over and over on special occasions, at ordination, every month at the full moon. I vow to proceed in peace and not cause harm. I vow to speak truthfully and not lie. I vow to speak kindly and not talk of others' faults and errors. I vow to be generous and not stingy. I vow to observe non-difference, not elevate self or blame others. And on and on. There's a bunch of them. So consider crossing the threshold. Consider supporting your intention with a vow. Second, aim to practice rather than achieve. As we work with our intention, if we set our eyes on achieving, countless difficulties will get in our way. We'll likely get discouraged. We might even give up. But if we set our eyes on practice, we step forward. We stumble, pick ourselves up, learn, step forward again. Through all these wild circumstances and alongside all these curious people that life sends our way. So with achieving mind, we have success and failure. But with practice mind, there's infinite opportunities to refine. The Buddha was not so concerned with beliefs or doctrine. Rather, his emphasis was on the quality of practice, how we engage with whatever arises in the course of daily life. And one example is his instruction on practicing purification. And he provides this great list of 44 ways that he encourages his monks to train to interact with others. And so here's a few of the lines, and they always end the same. He says, others will inflict harm. We shall not inflict harm. This is how we practice purification. Others will take what is not given. We shall abstain from taking what is not given. This is how we practice purification. Others will speak divisively. We shall abstain from divisive speech. Others will have ill will. We shall be benevolent. Others will be angry. We shall not be angry. This is how we practice purification. And it goes on and on, 44 ways each time. This is how we practice purification. So as we practice with our intention, there's no assured outcome. There's no certainty of results. There's only creating new conditions for new possibilities to unfold. And so, in a very real way, all of our actions are consequential. So, consider shifting from the intention from achieving something, from achievement, to practice. And then third, be both bold and subtle. Bold in the big picture, subtle in the details and the application. In the Zen tradition, the 4 bodhisattva vows are a daily practice. And a bodhisattva is an awakened being that works to ease the suffering of all. And on first appearance, these vows are absurd. Creations are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to transform them. Reality is boundless. I vow to perceive it. The awakened way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. So these are bold vows, unattainable really, and yet we take them daily. And we live them out in the subtlety of practice, refraining from harm, offering generosity, speaking with care, not holding too tightly to our perspectives. So it's bold in the big picture and subtle in the details and the application. It's like I vow to cause no harm. Now, let me fine-tune the details, like my gossip, my grudges, my jokes. I vow to cause no harm. And my spending, and my consumption, my trash. I vow to cause no harm. My political activity or inactivity, my practices as an employer, my silence. So consider being bold in the big picture to energize, and consider being subtle in the details to embody and make real. So we can consider these three approaches to working with our intentions. Support the intention with a vow, abandon the idea of achieving and focus more on practice, and being bold in the big picture and subtle in the application. So I'd like to share an example from my life, and not to suggest that my intention be your intention, but it might illustrate how one might encounter these three approaches. Growing up, I learned from my parents and from my church community the importance of loving kindness, nonviolence, forgiveness, cooperation. And when I turned 18, the federal government said I needed to register as a potential draftee for working in the military. And after a bit of consideration, I realized I simply couldn't do it. If I agreed to step forward for military work, I'd be abandoning my values and headed down a path that, to me, felt wrong. And so I refused to register. And at that time, there was a risk of some serious consequences for refusing, but it was pretty small. In the years that followed, I reflected more and more on how militarism was such a vast system of really institutionalized self-interest, really, and that it depended on tools of coercion and harm. And so I became more intent on not supporting it. And then I had my first jobs, and I saw that money was being withheld from my pay. And I started to explore what that was all about. And so I learned more about the vast amounts of money, human resources, natural resources that were required to keep feeding these demands to pay for past, present, and future militarism. And so it became clear to me that I just couldn't willingly go along. So here was my intention. I intend to not support this massive system that rests on the principles and tools of coercion and harm. It's bold, in the big picture. And then in the early 1980s, I decided, okay, I'm not going to voluntarily pay the government to feed this militarism. And so in 1985, I wrote a letter to officials saying that this was what I was doing and why. And ever since then, I've been open about this, that this intention is important to me, and I'm committed to working with it. And by making this personal commitment public, by declaring it openly, my intention has deepened. I've embraced it more fully. And as I began to sort out how I would proceed, I realized how this straightforward intention unravels into so many areas of life. For 40 years now, I've been working almost daily with some serious questions in the details. How's that going to work out? How can I earn a livelihood in a way that allows me to prevent my wages from being taken for military purposes? Large employers, they're all tangled in systems of compliance. Small employers especially fear law enforcement. Computers, being online now converts just about every bit of employment into a cog to financing the military system. So how can I earn my living? Should I file a tax return? Does that suggest that I'm obliged to pay a share to underwrite militarism? Should I pay some taxes? Should I pay any taxes at all? Refusing to help fund militarism is not looked upon kindly by the government. Those who don't play along face penalties. So I'm fine with risking those penalties. But if I have a partner, do I extend that risk? How will we arrange our lives together? How does that work? What about being a citizen? If a citizen's expected to support military business of their government, do I want to be a citizen? I'd have to say no. But if I can't, in good conscience, consent to this basic demand of citizenship, then what? Do I forego the perks of cooperating? Do I give up voting, easy access to banking, travel credentials, access to medical care, old age benefits? So these are all active questions. Each one requires a choice. This is an experiment for me. This is the practice of being bold in the big picture and then stepping into the muck of the details. Some of these questions I've settled and have accepted the risks. Some of these questions used to feel settled, but now they're nagging again. Some of these questions I've never settled. They've posed a lifetime of difficulty. And so I continue practice with this vow. And then, of course, there's the question of what am I trying to achieve here? Right? It's ridiculous to imagine that my refusal to go along with supporting militarism is going to make any dent in this huge system. Militarism enjoys support from all quarters. Politics and commerce and religion and academics and science and entertainment. Why should I bother? And this is how that notion of achievement can get in the way. I've always felt that a society cannot change significantly unless the individuals who constitute that society change significantly. So what else could possibly be the path to the end of the suffering of militarism, if not individuals, one at a time, refusing to go along with it? So this is my messy, uncertain, shifting, evolving intention, right? To not voluntarily pay the government to maintain militarism. It includes a vow, being bold in the big picture, working a way through settled details of daily life, abandoning the delusion of achievement, and really just focusing on practice. And as I work with this intention, I change. And as I change, I create new conditions in me and the world. And as conditions change, new possibilities unfold. So time passes swiftly, opportunity is lost. What's your bold intention? Your vow, maybe? What's your daily practice?
Thank you, Clark. Here's an untitled poem by Emily Dickinson. If I can stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain. If I can ease one life, the aching, or cool one pain, or help one fainting robin unto his nest again, I shall not live in vain. Libba Pinchot developed computer training for elementary school kids in the 60s. She led Head Start teacher training centers and taught college in the late 60s, early 70s. She was an organic dairy farmer and ran a small crafts business in the 70s, practiced as a family therapist in the 80s. She consulted to many corporations and co-authored a business book in the 80s and 90s. For the next 2.5 decades, she developed and ran an off-grid permaculture retreat center on Cortez Island. And in 2003, co-founded BGI Pinchot, the first MBA program focused on sustainability and social justice. She averaged a new 2 decades, she tells me, finishing with a PhD in 2018. She now coaches and consults with leaders who are engaging the members of their organization to make the world better through their work. Welcome, Libba.
Oh, thank you, dear Ruthie, for bringing me into this community. And thank you, Clark. I love the advice of bold vows and subtle practice. I haven't heard that before. That's really beautiful. So you can tell I must be 120 years old since I did all this stuff, but I don't know. I'm going to tell you just a couple of stories about my past, and then describe some of the concerns of the youth, and that their concerns most of us share, and then imagine how we might help. So I'm just called to tell you a little bit about my family. My mom was sent to an orphanage when she was 12 years old when her dad died, and we didn't discover this until about 10 years ago after her death, because it was her little secret. And she was the youngest, and her mother had a boarding house and felt she wasn't safe there. My dad also lost his dad at 12. They didn't know each other. And he was the oldest, and he supported his mom and 3 younger siblings for 20 years, at least, with no insurance, of course, in those days. And my dad, to feed his mom and siblings, he worked on the docks in Brooklyn, and then he got a little desk job, and then the Depression came, and he went to become a roughneck in Texas. And roughneck, if I have a picture I can't show you, but it was a really rough life to be a roughneck in the early oil business. My mom and dad met in Texas. She graduated from high school, the orphanage high school, at 15, and was a school teacher and working in Fort Worth. They married when she was 18. Sometimes she admits it might have been 17, and he was almost 30. And and they had 50 years together. But what was going on in the oil business at that time? And I bring it out because oil business is a big deal these days, obviously. Yes. But then there were many, many independents who were actively trying to resist the majors, the big consolidating oil corporations who were trying to take over. And so it was a group of about 100 independent oil and gas and producers in this community in the Midwest, Evansville, Indiana, they gathered together, they collaborated, they signed each other's leases, and they did everything possible to spread the risk and protect from corporatization of their business in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And I don't know where it is now. Their business was up and down, but my family, they stayed independent. My mom did some wonderful things. And my dad, when he was approaching my age, when he was about my age, approaching 80, he decided to do one last thing. And if you've ever gone by an oil well, you have seen the gas flaring off, probably. And this was when it was completely a lost byproduct. And like a lot of old timers, he'd had to make ends meet all his life. He was also a conservationist, and he couldn't stand that this was being flared off. And he was very old and he was kind of sick, but he struggled onto the airplane to go to DC for the last 2 years of his life in order to get approval to store the gas in salt mines in Southern Illinois, where he happened to work. And therefore you could use it for heat in the winter. You could store it down there. And it was the first underground gas storage thing. And in any event, I look up to him for doing one last thing. And it's so fitting that I'm talking about it at my age. So it wasn't just what they did, but it was how they did it. They were good neighbors. They put a handful of low-income kids through college, even though their income wasn't high. I love that Gibran quote that work is love made manifest. I think we've all known that for many years. And also there's a little short Rilke quote, cleave to the difficult. Have you ever heard that? It's like I keep it almost on my mirror, cleave to the difficult. And then there's my issue with the oil business. It's my legacy, right? And so here I am at nearly 80, still trying to convert us away from burning things we dig out of the ground, right? I have a Thich Nhat Hanh quote, which is, our actions are our only true belongings. We cannot escape the consequences of our actions. Our actions are the ground on which we stand. Thich Nhat Hanh. So I'm asking myself these days, what informed my best actions and what was best about those actions? And so I'm going to tell just a little bit about my life, the small piece of it, which is the first half seemed kind of accidental. And if you know what that feels like, and you look back and you say, well, maybe it wasn't so accidental. It was, I was this and that, but it feels like that, like I walked into a grad school fellowship because I was trying to sign up to be a teacher and I didn't have any other options. And suddenly they just said, oh, somebody left, we're giving you that. And then I was halfway through that program and 50 parents unannounced came to my ramshackle house and said, if you take this job as the ED of our first parent daycare center, then we get the building and we get the money because you're the only one in the whole state who's in this program that makes it legitimate. And I said, well, I'd have never seen a kid up close. I don't know anything about them. And they said that they'll take care of everything. Don't worry. You just have to, come and be that. And so that started my career. The second half of my career was less accidental, or career. The pastiche of all the things I did. When I was first starting BGI, I remember deciding with that bold intention, and it was a different decision. I decided we had to do social enterprise for teenagers because I had a house full of teenagers and they were despairing. They hit a wall. I don't want to go work in that world. What do you mean? And I said, well, if we could give them mentored education in their high school on doing a social enterprise, like, a soup kitchen or something, and then they could see that they could always land on their feet and they could have some choices in life. And it was just such a good idea. And I worked on it and I got people to help me for a year, almost 2 years. It was impossible to change the high school curriculum. So I've been doing entrepreneurship and companies, and the MBAs were in charge, and it was remedial, and they didn't understand entrepreneurship and they didn't understand relationships. It had all been educated out. And so I started BGI and got some friends to help me, and it was wonderful. But it's an example of my outer doesn't ring true with my inner, that I had to do that when I was working in corporations and felt this had to be different, or when I was with the teenagers and it had to be different, which is Anna's quote from last week. So what is the most important thing about that school? It's the circles. It's the respect. It's the collaboration. It's the spirit. It's the between. It's the quality of the interpersonal relationships and the between, what it's like. And I'd seen that at the best of my parents' life. I'd seen that everywhere that I'd been that really, really touched me. And I said, this is what's important, is how to establish quality of relationships in education. So anyway, let's fast forward 20 years. There's a research study that you may have heard about, but if not, it's worth it. 16 to 24-year-olds in 10 countries, 10,000 of these young people were surveyed. And the researchers said the results were devastating. 75% of this youth group agreed with the statement, the future is frightening. 60% were extremely worried or felt betrayed. Governments weren't protecting them, nor the next generation up. And of course, that's true. And 40% fear having children. So it may be the majority of the youth in the world understand the true predicament we're in and what the inaction means for them. But, you know, the researchers were really clear about the fact that these kids aren't concerned about themselves. They're really, really concerned about children and animals in the world. It's not about me, it's about protecting all of us, they said. And that sense of interdependency, and I go back to Clark's refreshing our sense of Buddhism, interdependency, our interconnected interests, the core wisdom of Buddhism. And the youth get it, right? And their climate anxiety and betrayal is part of something the researchers call moral injury, which is based on their deep compassion and caring. But it's an injury because they and we are injured by knowing we're complicit and not knowing what we can do about it. So, how do we help? Moral injury that was studied for 20 years in the VA and with vets. And what they discovered is that if they get people together to share their sadness and their guilt and so forth, and then give them the opportunity to work together to do something about it, what is a very dangerous moral and psychological disease gets much easier. I discovered a book by Dalai Lama about 15 years ago called Ethics for the New Millennium. I'll say that again, Ethics for the New Millennium. And it was like a huge relief. It's a book that I strongly suggest that people read because, you know, everyone's saying, oh, I'm compassionate, but he says, we have to do compassion. It's not a feeling. It's an action. And I quote Anna from last week too, do not be dismayed by the broken world. It can be mended. The broken world awaits the light that is you. So when we look at the moral injury, we have to realize I've got moral injury. I'm not doing enough. And the more we learn about all the needs of the world, you can feel really helpless. And so that's why this is a day of thinking about action in your church, because it's an antidote to the moral injury. And we're seeing the articles about it in healthcare, about healthcare professionals. You've been reading about the nurses who are just giving up, you know, and the doctors, because there's too much being asked of them for them to do what they know they have to do to be square with themselves. And that's moral injury. So I'm about to end, but I have just a couple of things that I thought might be little tips. How do we deal with these problems? What kind of action? Look at the structures. What is the system that causes the problems? One might be imbalance of power. That's when in doubt, balance the power. That's a quote from Virginia Satir. Right now, the oil companies have an imbalance of power on climate, corporate lobbyists, big pharmas, whatever. Look at our interconnections. Many of the ills of the world relate to the inability to see the interconnections. And if you look at the COVID vaccination situation, maybe we shouldn't be hoarding them. And climate change is forcing our attention on the wider interconnections, because no one firm, no one government can do anything about climate change without other people. It's a tragedy of the commons. And so we have to come together. So, taking a page from my parents' playbook, what is my one more thing? And I'm making a vow right here, which is I'm learning to podcast. And I'm writing a little book celebrating the variety of corporate activists who are changing the system from inside their workplaces, from their day jobs. They're vulnerable. I'll have to protect them. And I'd like to end with my very favorite quote from Danella Meadows, who was a friend of mine, a lady who wrote about systems, and she was a farmer too. Hunger, poverty, environmental degradation, economic instability, unemployment, chronic disease, drug addiction, and war, for example, persist in spite of the analytical ability and technical brilliance that have been directed towards eradicating them. No one deliberately creates these problems. No one wants them to persist, but they persist nonetheless. This is because they're intrinsically systems problems, undesirable behaviors characteristic of the system structures that produce them. The system produces these things because of its structure. And then she says, they will yield only as we reclaim our intuition, stop casting blame, see the system as the source of its own problems, and find the courage and wisdom to restructure it. Many of you are already doing your one more thing, but remember the youth, they need us to support their finding healing actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Liba. I heard these words from Joseph Bednarik's service earlier this month as a benediction. See, be seen, forget yourself and change your life. And while it's productive to promise ourselves to lose 5 pounds or clean the garage, it is quite another to resolve to practice seeing with our eyes, to practice seeing with our heads, to practice seeing with our hearts, and to see with such intention that we ourselves radiate the divine, and despite the so-called ravages of time, that we gleam, dazzle, flare, and glisten. More than anything, this world needs the loving brilliance of your radiating heart. With that beautiful music, I'll extinguish the chalice.